It's October the 25th, 1854. One of the most infamous days in British military history. By day's end, the flower of the British cavalry will have been sacrificed in the Valley of Death. A suicidal charge against powerful Russian guns after Britain's cowardly allies had fled. But the latest evidence from the Crimean battlefield itself tells a rather different story.
The charge of the Light Brigade against the guns at Balaklava was a pointless charge against something that was not a tactical or strategic objective.
It seems the legends of the Noble 600 and the Thin Red Line are far from the truth. And the story of the soldiers who actually saved the day lies untold.
If it weren't for the sacrifice that those men made, it is quite likely that the British forces would have been driven back to the sea.
Now, powerful new technology and groundbreaking historical detective work are shedding crucial light on the events of the charge of the Light Brigade. So who were the true heroes of the battle for Balaklava? In the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was starting to crumble, and Russia was flexing her muscles. The English and French came to the Turks' aid and declared war on Russia. The main theater for the fighting that followed was Russia's Crimean Peninsula. In October 1854, this war was 6 months old. The Allies were aiming to break Russian military power in the Black Sea by destroying the major naval base at Sevastopol. They had expected to capture it quickly, but Russian resistance was strong, and instead of swift victory, they faced a bitter siege. Now it was a moment of crisis for the Allies. Russian troops were threatening to relieve the pressure on Sevastopol by striking at Allied supply lines. Their objective, the vital British harbour of Balaklava.
Behind me is the entrance to Balaklava harbour. Everything the army needed had to come into this harbour, just over here, and be sent up from here to operations against Sevastopol and the army.
With the bulk of Allied troops needed for siege operations, Balaklava was vulnerable. Its defense was a line of 6 earthwork forts known as redoubts. They were sited along a low ridge called the Causeway, which separated 2 shallow valleys, south and north.
If this place fell, or if it was hazarded in any way at all, it would be the equivalent of cutting the throat of the British Army here in the Crimea.
Manning the 6 vital redoubts were lightly armed Allied Turkish soldiers of the Ottoman Empire. They were the first line of defense, intended to give early warning of any Russian advance. But miles from their nearest support, an attack would leave them isolated and cut off. They were to play a crucial role in the Battle of Balaklava. Yet of all the events that day, one is remembered above all: the charge of the Light Brigade. And its story has been woven into a legend. It tells how the Russians launched their attack on Balaklava at dawn. The Turkish troops at the redoubts fled in terror, abandoning their guns. Commander-in-Chief Lord Raglan ordered the Light Brigade to stop the Russians seizing those abandoned guns. But somehow a misunderstood order led to the 600 riding the wrong way to their doom in a storm of Russian artillery fire. But not everyone believes things happened quite the way of the legend.
Popular history would suggest that the men of the Light Brigade were the great heroes of the Battle of Balaklava, but militarily and honestly, I think the true heroes of that battle were the men who defended No. 1 Redoubt on Comrabert Hill.
At the eastern end of the causeway, Canroberts Hill, site of Redoubt No. 1, was the key to the line of redoubts. If it was captured, the other redoubts would be outflanked and would fall like dominoes. Realizing this, the Russians began their attack on Balaklava harbour with an overwhelming assault on Redoubt No. 1. The task of holding this vital defensive position was left to just a few hundred Ottoman Turks. In the outcry following the Light Brigade disaster, the British press, hungry for scapegoats, derided Turkish soldiers as hopeless incompetents.
In the Black Sea.
But Mike Hargrave Mawson would like to prove that the truth is very different. Mike is a member of the Crimean War Research Society. They're determined to find out what really happened in the fight for Redoubt No. 1. First, they need to find it. Working alongside the society is archaeologist Phil Freeman. He'll search for evidence on the ground. Mike and the others give him an idea of what he should look for.
I mean, one of the key things we would love to find out is not so much what finds you can pull out for us, but the actual plan of what has been disturbed earth.
Yes, I agree.
Traces of where earth has been disturbed to build defences should still exist on Canroberts Hill, even after 150 years. To look for them, Phil will use groundbreaking new technology. High-resolution satellite imagery from the new generation of commercial satellites like Iconos is revealing the landscape of the Battle of Balaklava in astonishing detail for the very first time. A single Iconos image taken from an altitude of 400 miles reveals the entire Balaklava battlefield. The extraordinary resolution of the satellite photo clearly shows Canroberts Hill.
You can see the impressions in the ground of where the ground has been disturbed, where soil and stones have been heaped up.
By enhancing it, you could see.
But Phil also needs to know details of the redoubt's layout.
It'd be interesting to have some idea of how the redoubt would be laid out internally, what kind of structures we could expect to see inside it.
Nothing.
Nothing at all? Tent
No.
accommodation?
No.
It was a very crude defence thrown up very quickly. If you read the accounts, both from the Russian side and from the Allied side, it was perfectly easy for the assaulting troops simply to jump over it.
My impression is...
Research into the Crimean War is now being revolutionized by the opening up of the Ukraine and the possibility of exploring the battlefields.
This is the great opportunity where they're welcoming us in to get in there and seize the day.
With the satellite imagery and the Society's specialist advice, Phil and his team will be the first archaeologists to search for clues as to what actually happened in the opening minutes of the Battle of Balaklava 150 years ago. Once a forbidden zone controlled by the Soviet military, the Crimea is an archaeological treasure chest. Fought over by armies again and again over the millennia, its landscape is littered with relics from ancient times to the Cold War. Armed with the satellite imagery, Phil Freeman and his team arrive at Canroberts Hill to search for evidence of the Turks' role in events leading up to the fatal charge of the Light Brigade. Their first task is to find Redoubt No. 1. The satellite photo gives Phil a clue as to where to look on the kilometre-wide hill. They've enabled him to identify a small area of disturbed earth on the southeastern side. But it's not so easy to pick this area out at ground level. Having been guided in by cutting-edge science, the team then need to employ more traditional techniques. An accurate terrain survey will help reveal the disturbed areas in the landscape.
Well, we're standing on top of Can Roberts Hill, and as you can see as we look round, see that the site is a mishmash of banks and ditches. The problem for us is that there is a considerable quantity of this sort of earthwork activity going on.
What we need to do is like sort of lay out grids first of all, and then on each of the points where the grids intersect with one another we'll take a reading, and from that we can then produce a 3D model.
Whilst the survey continues, Phil goes to look at another Crimean War redoubt nearby. Bezimyanya, no-name hill, was in use at the same time as Redoubt Number 1, and its construction and size might offer Phil clues as to what he should look for on Can Roberts Hill.
Well, they've opened up quite a bit more of the bank, and in doing so, in extending the trench in this area, they've taken out part of the Crimean War fortifications. What that's left, among other things, is quite a good cross-section of those fortifications. You can see the initial creation of the bank here, and then a series of fills which run up against the wall, whose face you can see on the other side quite well in the new trench.
Artifacts from the site show that the redoubt was occupied by Turkish troops. Together with Simon Richardson, the team's metal detectorist, Phil gets an idea of the kind of artifacts they might find at Can Roberts Hill.
That must be one. It's a bullet. Bullet, right.
These are the buttons. You know the regiment?
Yes, the 7th.
Anything else?
Yes, a small Turkish pipe.
Obviously, we can't find those with a detecting survey, but they should be lying around as surface finds if we're going to, if we're lucky.
Surface finds. And we have a plate there with a
Shaka plate.
41st.
And there's also one other find that we've heard, which I know about, and it's this.
Oh, wow.
It's a silver coin, believe it or not, despite the colour, and it's been pierced. It's been reused either for jewellery or for people keeping their cash on their neck. It dates to about 1830, and it's minted in Istanbul.
Yeah, it's a nice inscription.
It would be great if we could get similar sort of finds from Can Roberts, but I think we'll be very lucky if we find that sort of thing. Quite a pretty piece.
The finds are sparse, but the Bezimyanya site shows that despite poor conditions, Turkish soldiers were able to construct a considerable position. Phil is encouraged. Maybe he can find something similar on Can Roberts Hill. Back with the team, the terrain survey is now complete, but it reveals another problem. All around the target area is a confused tangle of earthworks. The Crimean War isn't the only conflict to have left scars in the Balaklava landscape. In World War II, the entire region saw desperate fighting between the Red Army and Hitler's Wehrmacht.
You find scattered around all kinds of things. For instance, look like a couple of foxholes here from the Second War, bomb craters, again scrapes and scoops.
But after searching through the maze of confusing earthworks, Phil thinks he's located the structure visible in the satellite photo. He believes this could be Redoubt Number 1, but it's nothing like as substantial as the fort at Bezimyanya. Somehow, Phil needs to isolate what he thinks could be the Crimean War earthwork from the later World War II remains. He asks the opinion of local archaeologist Dmitry Stonyi. Dmitry is an expert on the World War II remains in the Balaklava area. One by one, he's able to identify and eliminate the World War II trenches and mortar pits. What remains could be the surviving Crimean War earthworks.
And we come into this, what looks to be a very interesting feature around the corner. Could you tell me what you think it is?
I think this is a rest of maybe British, maybe took battery, gun battery of Crimean War. A road, two guns, and wall. You can see a very good view to village Kamari. and very good road from Russian position to Balaklava. It's very important, very strategical.
Phil is confident they've at last found redoubt number 1. Less than 40 meters long and 15 meters wide, it's little more than a gun platform cut into the slope, defended by a shallow bank and ditch, overlooking the vital narrow pass down to Balaklava harbour. It would have left the Turkish soldiers desperately vulnerable, with little shelter against attack. Phil now needs to search for evidence of the Turkish soldiers and their struggle to defend the position. But there's a problem. World War II has left another legacy.
We're getting things like clips, shells, we've got webbing, clothing lying around.
A piece of a cannon shell there. A human toe bone there. Russian cartridges. Must be a couple of thousand here laid on the floor. I mean, it's a problem as far as a metal detecting survey goes, because in this particular area it's so, I mean, it's just a blanket covering. To get through this dense layer of material, it's going to be very, very difficult indeed.
Though he fears it will be an uphill struggle, Simon begins his painstaking search in the redoubt. Documentary records suggest life would have been tough for the Turkish soldiers.
It must have been like hell on earth. Here they were dumped in the autumn or winter of a particularly miserable climate. It was cold, it was wet. For the previous 3 or 4 weeks, the total ration issue that they had been given to eat was 2 biscuits. And they'd been living off what they could find lying around on the ground. And bear in mind, you've got a huge army of invaders picking the ground clean. There wasn't much left for the poor Turks.
Though traces of the Turks' daily life may be difficult to locate, Simon is at first sure there'll be plenty of evidence of the battle for the redoubt. But he's wrong.
We're actually inside redoubt number 1 at the moment. I've set the metal detector as I would set it in the average field, looking for small artefacts such as buttons and musket balls and things like that. But to show you what we're up against, as you can hear, there's a complete covering of ferrous material. The material is all Second World War. And to try and penetrate this and pick out minute finds such as pistol balls, very, very difficult indeed. Nearly impossible.
Frustrated, Phil and Simon decide to change their search area. Phil has worked out from the recorded position of the Russian guns where any cannonballs or shells which overshot the redoubt would have landed. Luckily, it's in an area the survey shows is less damaged by World War II. Simon starts a new search a few hundred meters from the redoubt. Within hours, the change of tactics pays off.
We're standing on the west side of Canroberts, looking across to Balaklava and Sevastopol. As we look down the slope, you can see a series of red markers, flag markers, which represent hits that the metal detectorist has made. Each one represents one large caliber lead ball.
There's something about the spread of these finds that seems significant.
There is an interesting pattern, effectively a fan, as we look down.
The characteristic fan-shaped distribution pattern suggests they're lead balls from an air-bursting Russian shell.
We found quite a spread, 13.5 pieces, which we're fairly certain this is from a spherical case shot, which is a hollow cannonball set with a fuse, so it bursts in the air over cavalry or infantry. Quite a devastating weapon. When I found the first one, I was very excited because I knew more or less what it was. And then when the second one came up, I knew it wasn't just an isolated find, and that had a good chance of finding more and more.
This shell must have overshot Redoubt number 1 and exploded on the other side. The first solid evidence of the devastating kinds of weapons the Turkish troops on Canroberts Hill faced. The Russian attack on Redoubt number 1 began at dawn when a massed battery of more than 30 heavy cannons opened fire. Historical documents show that the 600 Turkish soldiers were likely armed with only 3 British cannons. As the survey has revealed, they not only faced devastating shell fire, but their redoubt was little more than an earthen bank a few feet high. Unprotected, outnumbered and outgunned, the Turks could make little reply. But bravely they hung on.
I doubt whether a similar number of British troops would have lasted as long. It must have been like being in a bombardment during the First World War in a trench. When you saw the enemy infantry advancing, you had to stand. You had to defend your redoubt. And they did.
In the outcry following the charge of the Light Brigade disaster, British newspapers ridiculed the Turkish troops. But the evidence shows they must have been disciplined and well led. Dr. Firuz Yassemi is a specialist in Middle Eastern studies. He's been looking into the composition and training of the Ottoman army.
Up until the Crimean War, nobody was really sure what the Turkish army was or was not capable of. A European-style officer cadre or officer corps was a new phenomenon in the Ottoman army, and it only existed since the 1830s, when they'd set up a war college.
At the time of the Crimean War, the Istanbul War College was the Sandhurst of the Ottoman Empire. Far from being ramshackle and incompetent, the Turkish army of the 1850s actually had a higher proportion of trained officers than the British army.
One point that I think you can make is that within the Ottoman army, warfare was viewed as a religious duty. A man who was killed became a martyr, a shahid. A man who survived was a ghazi, a warrior for the faith.
This helps explain why, despite being only lightly armed and undersupplied, the Turkish troops bravely stood their ground before finally being overrun. Yet this heroic last stand is glossed over in most histories of the battle. It seems the myth of the Turks' cowardice did not arise by chance. Mike Hargrave Mawson believes the British commander Lord Raglan was caught completely off guard by the Russian attack.
Opinions are divided, but it would appear that Raglan and his entourage got up onto the Sapoon Heights about 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. What isn't at issue is the fact that the Russian assault began at 5 that morning.
Raglan was slow to react to the Russian attack. By the time he arrived at his command position, the Turks at Redoubt number 1 had been facing Russian bombardment for nearly 3 hours. Official accounts of the sequence of events deliberately covered up Raglan's delayed response.
Raglan, when he came to write his report, didn't want to point out that they'd taken 3 hours to get to the battle. And so 3 hours got truncated down to a few minutes. And it was the Russians attacked, the Turks ran.
The fall of the redoubts marked the end of the opening phase of the battle. But this set in motion an unstoppable chain reaction that led to disaster. This time, Lord Raglan would have a grandstand view. It's 10:30 a.m., nearly 3 hours after the battle for Canroberts Hill. After number 1 fell, redoubts 2, 3 and 4 followed like dominoes. From his position on the Sapoon Ridge, overlooking the battlefield, the British commander suddenly noticed an alarming development down in the captured redoubts.
Lord Raglan can see that the Russians are bringing up engineering equipment and putting tackles on the British guns that the Turks have had to abandon. And in the Wellingtonian military tradition, you must never lose a gun.
Panicked into immediate action, Raglan ordered the Light Brigade to advance to try and stop the Russians taking away the captured guns.
If you're going to send an order that must be acted on immediately, you send the fastest man in the army.
Captain Lewis Nolan was the obvious choice. An impetuous young cavalryman, Nolan rode at breakneck speed down from the Sapoon Ridge into the South Valley to deliver the order to the cavalry commander, Lord Lucan. What happened next is the key moment where everything went wrong and the Light Brigade was sent to its doom.
He goes up to Lord Lucan and he hands him the message from Raglan, and Lucan cannot see the guns.
Lucan was mystified. He needed clarification and so asked Nolan, "Where are the guns?" To which Nolan replied, "There are your guns," throwing out his arm to point in the general direction of the redoubt guns. But also in this direction was another set of guns, the Russian Don Cossack battery.
The order was vague. Nolan was angry. Lucan was useless. So Lucan accepts the order to charge guns, and he's just going to charge the wrong guns.
Somehow, a fatal confusion was made between the captured British guns being dragged away as trophies and the Russian Don Cossack guns, which were ready for action. Historians have always blamed Nolan's gesture for the massacre of the Light Brigade, believing that he pointed to the Don Cossack guns either deliberately or by mistake. But is this really what happened? Richard Rutherford Moore is a battlefield explorer and guide. For more than a decade, he's been studying the actual location of the Balaklava charge. Richard believes the key to solving the mystery of what actually happened lies in understanding the terrain. He wants to establish for the first time exactly what the principal characters could see during the battle. He teams up with remote sensing specialist Jessica Trelogan. Through her work at Bezimyanya, she's completed the first terrain-accurate survey of the Balaklava valleys. The first crucial viewpoint they must establish is that of the Commander-in-Chief, Lord Raglan. Finding Raglan's command position up on the high Sapoon Ridge will take some detective work. A clue lies in the work of Roger Fenton, the world's first celebrated war photographer. This photograph was taken after the battle from Raglan's command position. Maybe this will help them find the spot.
That bend is roughly where redoubt number 2 is. In the foreground, we've seen these enormous rocks. We're looking off towards Balaklava. So this rock should be somewhere on this crest, within about 100 metres of where we are, 50 metres either side.
In 1854, there were no trees here, and so the viewpoint takes some locating amidst the dense undergrowth.
What does it look like from your side?
So hard to tell with the vegetation in the way. I think maybe.
Satisfied that they're within meters of the spot where Raglan watched the charge of the Light Brigade, Jessica records the position.
You know, we think we're more or less in the right place in the photograph. So I think it would be really neat to see what this would have looked like without trees in it. You know, we can't do anything about it now, but we can take it virtually, look at the computer, do a little line of sight analysis, and see if they would have been able to have a clear shot through here.
Здравствуйте, моя подружка.
Здравствуйте.
It's an amazing piece of technology.
Well, this is a geographic information system. And the nice thing about it is the way that it integrates different types of data. So you've got graphic data, topography, our Iconis image that we could zoom in on, different levels of scale, going out all the way to the whole Crimea.
The computer incorporates satellite imagery into a full-terrain survey, enabling Jessica to test lines of sight between any given points in the area. She first plots in the key points in the Balaklava battle, including the line of redoubts. She then adds in Commander-in-Chief Lord Raglan's viewpoint.
It'd be interesting to see from here just what Lord Raglan could see.
The green line reveals that Raglan could have seen the captured guns being removed from the redoubts. He also would have been able to see the Don Cossack battery at the far end of the North Valley. This confirms the accepted historical accounts. But what could Lucan see? His viewpoint is easier to find.
This is the British memorial to the Battle of Balaklava, and we're standing in redoubt number 5. In this area here was where Lord Lucan stood and received the orders from Lord Raglan. The big problem I've always had in trying to understand this part of the battle is the terrible view that you get over the area in front of you from the position in which that 4th order was received. You can see the captured redoubts, number 1, number 2, part of number 3, but you can't see anything that's going on beyond them because of the hill directly in front of you. You can't see anything at all of the North Valley of Balaklava.
Richard believes that Nolan could not have pointed to the wrong guns because it wasn't possible to see them from this position. But it might just be that the view has changed in the 150 years since the battle. There are now trees in the line of sight.
So from redoubt number 5, how much of this area here on the other side of the ridge could we see?
When Lucan's viewpoint is plotted in, it's a very different story.
Tells us. No.
He could see neither the redoubt guns being removed nor the Don Cossack guns. He must have been totally confused by the order. Richard's theory is confirmed. Nolan could not have pointed directly at either set of guns. They were not visible from this position. Lucan, confused and unsighted, passed the order to Lord Cardigan, commander of the Light Brigade, and the cavalry set off down into the North Valley. At first, there didn't seem to be a problem.
Raglan looks down and he sees his Light Brigade moving off along the valley floor. So far, so good. Nolan, who knew which guns the Light Brigade was supposed to be going for, is also thinking, fair enough. We're moving off down the valley, we're going to go to the redoubts and we'll stop the Russians carrying off British guns.
Suddenly, Nolan must have finally realized something was very wrong.
There comes a point where for some reason Nolan rides out in front of the brigade and heads off towards the Causeway Heights.
Raglan expected, Nolan expected Cardigan to turn right. Nolan rides out in front of Lord Cardigan, going, "Three's right, three's right, turn to the right in threes." And Cardigan doesn't understand what Nolan's shouting about. He thinks that Nolan, who is an arrogant son of a sea cook anyway, is trying to lead the charge himself, and Cardigan just puts his head down and keeps charging.
The Russian guns at the same time hear fire. One of the 18-pounders sends a shell over, and it explodes exactly where Nolan is at the time. A shell splinter goes straight across his chest. He emits a loud shriek. His sword falls from his hand, and eventually he tumbles from his horse to be ridden over by the ranks of the Light Brigade after him.
Nolan was the man who'd set the charge in motion. With his death, the last hope to avoid disaster was gone.
So what Raglan sees is one half of his cavalry force charging in the wrong direction. And worse than that, Raglan sees half of his cavalry charging to certain destruction.
There was now nothing anybody could do as the Light Brigade ploughed on down the valley like a runaway train. The Russian gun batteries around the valley opened fire.
The Russian gunner at that point can't see through the smoke, he only sees his own gun. But the Russian gunners, even through the noise and the shock of serving their pieces and firing their guns, could feel the rumble coming up through their feet, a subsonic rumble.
The moment of surprise is now past for the Russian artillery. The Light Brigade are getting very close to the guns. There's going to come a point where the charge will be blown, the lances will come down, the swords will go out, everybody will dig their spurs in and hit the target. They hit the guns and this terrible fight developed around the battery. One British trooper said the entire place was like darkness. It was like fighting at night. It was surrounded by an inky blackness of gun smoke, clashes of swords, men shouting, horses screaming.
Although bravely executed, the charge was a complete disaster. Commander-in-Chief Lord Raglan and the rest of the British Army could only look on in stunned silence as one by one the remnants of the devastated brigade returned back up the North Valley. But what happened to these survivors?
George Loy Smith. The last who returned up the valley after the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaklava.
Ken Horton is the world's foremost expert on the men who made up the Light Brigade. He spent more than 30 years tracking down the amazing stories of the individuals who took part. Troop Sergeant Major George Loy Smith of the 11th Hussars is one of the most celebrated among the survivors.
This is an amazing collection of stuff. How remarkable to save all this. Piece of Russian black bread found on the battlefield at Alma. Looks a little toasted now.
Loy Smith's extraordinary collection of Crimean War artifacts includes the actual jacket he wore in the charge, complete with the button he took from a man in the Russian 11th Hussars.
This is Loy Smith's own tunic, and it's pretty well identified by the tag. There, in fact, is the Russian button and the number 11 on it. This button was cut off the jacket of one of the 11th Russian Hussars at Balaklava. Amazing, isn't it?
It was during the course of this painstaking research that Ken uncovered a startling fact that would change the accepted story of the Light Brigade. He'd found the truth behind one of the most enduring myths of the Noble 600. Ken Horton's research into the men of the Light Brigade has led him through the medical records, wills and gazetteers which record the human face of Queen Victoria's army. This painstaking documentary work has enabled Ken to piece together the stories of the individuals who made up the famous brigade.
Private James Glenister, age 22, good character. Comminuted fracture of the lower jaw by pistol shot in the cavalry charge at Balaklava. The ball passed across below the chin and he is much disfigured. These are human records, and one I like to collect. It is the information of the men that were in the charge and how they suffered.
As Ken began to uncover more and more stories of charge survivors, he realized the truth.
There were only 102 killed outright from the 670. 56 were taken prisoner, of which half of those died in captivity. But at the end of the war, coming back to England, I'm always reckoning that at least 450 of those original men did return to these shores.
The 600 were not wiped out at all. Though the brigade was written off militarily, nearly 6 out of 7 Light Brigade men survived the famous charge. How then did the myth come about that it was annihilated? Lurid British newspaper reports sensationalized the scale of the disaster, and Tennyson's famous poem popularized this inaccurate myth of epic sacrifice. Although the Light Brigade faced artillery during the charge, has the scale of Russian fire been exaggerated? Is there a way, more than 150 years later, that we can find out? The answer can be found by a careful mathematical examination of the timing of the charge. From accounts, we know it took the brigade only 7.5 minutes to reach the Don Cossack battery 2,000 meters down the valley. 10 minutes after 11 a.m., the brigade moved off. At 30 seconds, they would have entered the field of fire of the left-hand battery. 10 guns on the Fedokeen Hills firing solid round shot and explosive shell. A cavalry charge should be a carefully timed advance, but as the fire came in, the brigade quickly accelerated. The battery could have fired only around 70 rounds before the brigade was through their field of fire. At 3 minutes, the brigade would have come under long-range fire from the 8 Don Cossack guns. At 5 minutes, this field of fire would have overlapped with the right-hand battery, 8 guns on the causeway. This should have caused more casualties, but the brigade now accelerated downhill with the racetrack camber of the valley. At 6 minutes, the crossfire would have ceased as the brigade neared the end of its charge, and the causeway guns held their fire to avoid hitting Don Cossack gunners. At 7 minutes, the brigade would have been within point-blank range of the Don battery. But the Russian gunners were at a disadvantage, unsighted by their own gun smoke. They would have fired only approximately 100 rounds before at 7.5 minutes, the Light Brigade hit them. In total, the 26 Russian guns can only have fired around 200 shots. The whole infamous charge and withdrawal took less than 30 minutes. Despite the famous legend, the Light Brigade was never under fire from all 3 sides at once. Although far fewer men died than was realized, the charge was still a needless sacrifice of young men's lives. Russian troops remained in control of the causeway redoubts, and the lost guns were never recaptured.
The only effect that the charge of the Light Brigade had on the war as a whole was to convince the Russians that British soldiers were mad and were dangerous and were liable to do just about anything, that they were murderous, and don't discount that, because scaring the hell out of the enemy is a good thing to do in war. But from the point of view of strategic or tactical aims, the charge of the Light Brigade is irrelevant.
Much more relevant to the outcome of the battle was the Turks' defense of Redoubt No. 1. They had faced at least 30 Russian guns in a single massed battery, more than the Light Brigade faced. But the Turks were not moving targets, they were sitting ducks. With no cover but the shallow earth ramparts, they endured relentless Russian bombardment for almost 3 hours, 6 times longer than the charge of the Light Brigade. And the Turks had still yet another unsung role to play in the battle for Balaklava.
When the redoubt fell, 170 Turks lay dead. Their fellows fled back across the South Valley. Russian cavalry were following them up, harrying them, slashing at them with sabres, cutting their heads in half, forcing them to flee at top speed. Mad panic, but a lot of them didn't. With the men from the redoubts numbers 3 and 4, they formed up on the next line of the defences of Balaklava, Sir Colin Campbell's 93rd Highlanders.
The Light Brigade disaster was a mere sideshow in the Battle of Balaklava compared with the Highlanders' vital stand. Now remembered as the Thin Red Line, the 93rd's action saved Balaklava harbour and so the entire British war effort from Russian attack.
There was about twice as many Turks as there were 93rd Highlanders in the Thin Red Line. But of course all that anyone ever remembers is the Thin Red Line.
But even this vital contribution to the battle was underplayed. The Turkish troops became the pariahs of the Allied army.
Eventually, those Turkish troops that were left in the Crimea were set to carrying things as beasts of burden. They would carry wounded British and French down to the ships. They would carry out food and firewood from Balaklava harbour up to the camps. They weren't allowed to fight again. They weren't allowed to do anything military again. They were basically two-legged donkeys.
Those who remained of the defenders of Redoubt No. 1 did not survive the terrible Crimean winter. Whilst the charge of the Light Brigade passed into legend, the story of the Turks slipped into oblivion on the barren, steep slopes of Canroberts Hill.